Welcome into Unbreakable, a mental health podcast with Jay Glazer. I'm your host, Jay Glazer. And, the guest I have on right now probably doesn't know how special he is to me. And the reason why I say that is you just meet some people along the way in your journey, in my mental health journey, that for me, I just go, oh, man, this guy just resonates with me. And I feel like there's help around the corner for me. And that's who he is. His name is Jim Kwik. He is a brain coach, a podcaster, writer, entrepreneur, just came out with Limitless, a book, which is a bestseller across everything. And, Jim, I appreciate you joining us. You're dealing with the brain. It's not like, hey, there's, at least for us, we don't know, hey, here's the elbow in your brain. Here's the knee in your brain. For me, it's just, okay, the brain. But there's so many different parts of our brain that affect how we behave and we act. How did you, I'm going to say you're a brain expert. How did you become a brain expert? And you're self-taught, which is the crazy part for me. So kind of give our listeners a little background on how you became the brain health expert.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to giving some practical nuggets for people. I really do believe that brain health is intimately connected to mental health. And, my brain, it's interesting. My inspiration really was my desperation. Talking about brain health, I had a traumatic brain injury when I was a child. I was in kindergarten class and there was these fire engines outside and nobody could see because we're so, short and we couldn't see outside the window. So everyone grabbed chairs and I grabbed my chair and I ended up falling headfirst into this iron radiator. And I was rushed to the emergency room, lost all this blood. I was unconscious. And
wow,
my parents said, I was never really the same afterwards. It was weird. Like I was 5 years old, right? I was very playful, energetic, creative, but I became very shut down. And where I really showed up was in school. I had poor focus, poor memory. I had processing issues. Teachers, what that means is for me, teachers would repeat themselves over and over again. And then I would pretend to understand, but I didn't understand anything. It took me an extra few years to learn how to just read. And that was very difficult. It was very embarrassing. When they passed around that book and, to read out loud and I just would, I would dread those times. I would get such a knot in my stomach and just, the book would come to me and I would just look at it and I would just pass it on because, the words didn't, do anything for me. And
that's so exposed as a child, right? It's just so.
Yeah, especially those.
And scary. Oh my God.
Those formidable years, like it definitely imprints on you. I remember one time I was 9 years old and I was being teased and bullied pretty bad in school, like a lot of people, but, and that didn't make it any better, but, I was slowing down the class on this particular day and I was being harassed a little bit, given, some stuff for it. And a teacher came to my defense to protect me from the other kids. And all I remember, she pointed to me in front of the whole class and said, "Leave this kid alone. That's the boy with the broken brain."
Oh, and, wow.
Adults have to be very careful with their external words because they often become a kid's internal words.
That's your label then. Yeah. Oh God.
And we talk about limitless, that label became my limit and it became my self-talk. Every single time I did badly in school, which was every day, every time I wasn't picked for sports, which was like all the time, I would always say, because I have the broken brain. And that became more of my identity. And so at that time also, my parents had many jobs like immigrant parents often do, and living in the back of a laundromat that my mom worked at. And so I was being raised by my grandmother, but at the same time, she started showing early signs of Alzheimer's when I was 5, 6. She eventually passed when I was 7. And it was really hard because she was my superhero. She was my closest, she was my best friend. But it was weird as a child going through my issues to watch, an adult go through those issues. And so, it gives you a sense of hopelessness, and, my message for people, eventually, many years later, I figured out ways to compensate and, unleash, these, I call metaphorically superpowers. I think we all have these innate talents that could be developed and discovered. And, but I realized school was, a place to learn what to learn, but not necessarily how to learn, and there's a lot of things that I feel like could have been better in school in terms of learning how to learn, social, emotional learning would have been very valuable back in school. And I realized that it's not how smart you are, but it's how are you smart? Not how smart you are, but how are you smart? And I,
Explain that a little bit. Explain that a little bit more.
yeah, it's interesting. Like if I was to ask everybody right now to, I don't know, or write their name first and last with their dominant hand, and everyone could do it pretty easily without much effort. It's comfortable, pretty good results. But if I ask you to switch hands and underneath it, write your name with your opposite non-dominant hand, for most people, it would feel a little awkward. It would take longer. The quality of the writing wouldn't be quite as good. And I realized that it's, like if you've ever been a subject in school, maybe that we just didn't get, maybe the way the teacher
That'd be all of them for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I was like good in one class and that was it. But that was, I was on the other side of the bell curve that made the other side possible. Right. When you have that label, I realized that sometimes the way a teacher teaches is different than a student or a human being prefers to learn. And so it's kind of like you're two ships in the night and you pass each other and there's no connection, and sometimes we're trying to learn it with the opposite hand. And so it takes longer. It feels awkward. The quality or the fidelity is not quite as good. And so, the nature of my work is really, I want to offer hope and help to those who are told that they were limited. And a lot of those limitations, I feel like, happen mentally. It's in the conversation you and I have had about our mindset.
Yep.
And so, and Limitless is not about being perfect at all. It's just about advancing and making some progress. And my goal is to show the world really what they're capable of.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I write in my book a lot about my ADD, the depression, anxiety, ADD, the bipolar, you name it, I got it, right? I got LMNOP, whatever. But, they would say that I had a learning disability because of my ADD. And, years later, when I try to talk about it to teachers, I'm like, no, I didn't have a learning disability. I just didn't learn the way you taught. Yeah. Right? Just the same way I coach a lot of fighters and football players and MMA. I've coached a lot of people do some really great things and overcome things. That's the way I coach, right? It doesn't, and, you may learn it. I got to make sure you learn it in a certain way, but certainly I'm not learning disabled if I'm able to do all this. I just, again, I just wrote my second book, right? Unbreakable. There's no learning disability there. I just don't learn the way you teach it, which is what it seems like. It kind of falls right in line with what you're talking about right now. Let's figure out the best way for us to learn. You
could say that, some people have teaching ability, disabilities, on the other side of it, and so, and again, it's finding what works for us. And my thing is not against teachers at all. I think teachers are my mother became a special education teacher, in her hopes to help me also. And she dedicated her life in the public school system, recently retired. But, teachers are some of the most compassionate, caring, competent, committed individuals. They're not necessarily compensated maybe as they should be. But, no doubt. But yeah, it's along the same themes of Unbreakable, showing people really how resilient they could be, and also how forgiving they could be of themselves and accepting they could be of themselves, and without, and it's hard. It's easy to say don't judge yourself, and be kind to yourself and love yourself. It's a lot harder sometimes in practice. But part of self-care is falling in love with that person in the mirror that's staring back at you, that's been through so much, but it's undoubtedly still standing. Right?
So when did you stop referring to yourself as the kid with the broken brain? Like you had to do that yourself. You had to fight back yourself.
Yeah.
How did you flip that script?
So there are a number of moments, along the way. Probably the most pivotal one was when I was 18. I was fortunate enough to get into a local university, and I thought freshman meant you can make a fresh start. That's literally what I thought. Because I struggled every single day, and I thought, like, all right, I take all these classes. I'm going to show the world, show myself that, I am worth something. I am enough. Because it's frustrating because it wasn't because I didn't have the discipline or the work ethic. I would work 2 or 3 times harder than people around me, but I would do worse. And that's, very discouraging. But I took all these classes and I did end up doing worse. And I was feeling I had to quit school. And, because I didn't have the money to be in school, and I didn't want to waste it. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings, and better to take whatever resources I had for, my brother or sister. And I was telling this to a friend of mine. He was like, "Hey, before you like quit school, that's a big decision. And before you tell your parents or your folks, your family, why don't you just get some perspective?" He's like, "I'm going home this weekend to visit my family. Why don't you come with, get some space?" And I realized that a change of perspective, a change of place, or a change of people you spend time with kind of gives you a different point of view. And I visit the family, and they're pretty well off, a lot different than the way I grew up. But the father walks me around his property on the water before dinner and asks me a very innocent question. I don't usually share this. This is I love you. I love your content and your show and your book. It's so raw and it's so real. And you create like a very safe
Thank
space
you.
for people to to be vulnerable like that. But
Thank you.
I he asked me the question like, how's school? And that's the worst question you could ask me at the time. And I tell him I just break down in front of this stranger. I start bawling, and I'm pretty emotionally reserved, but I start and very introverted, because when you have the broken brain, you don't want to get called on. You don't want the spotlight. You never have the answers, right? So I was very shy. I always sit behind the tall kid in class, never wanted, had the answers. But I start bawling in front of this stranger, and I just tell my whole story about, my accident and being, school's not for me and I'm broken. And he's like, "Jim, why are you in school? What do you want to be? What do you want to do? What do you want to have? What do you want to share?" And no one's ever asked me those questions, honestly, before, Jay. Like, no, like we weren't big dreamers, back, growing up. And I go to answer him after some, thinking about it. And he says, "Stop." And he pulls out a notebook and he tears a couple of sheets out, gives me a pen, and makes me write it down. And I don't know how much time goes by, but I end up having, like, some people call it a bucket list, like a dream list. And I think the exercise is over. So I start folding it to put in my pocket, and he grabs it out of my hand, and I start freaking out. And I was like, okay, there's this complete stranger reading my dreams, right? Like something I've never shared with anyone or even acknowledged for my own self. And I don't know how much time goes by, but he looks up and he says, "Jim, you are this close to everything on this list." I don't know if people are watching this on video or not, but I'm just spreading my index fingers like a foot apart. And I'm like, no way. Give me 10 lifetimes. I'm not going to crack that list. Very smart, wise man. He takes his fingers and he puts them to the side of my head, meaning what's in between, my mind, my brain is really the key. And he doesn't just stop there. He ends up taking me to a room of his home that's wall to wall, ceiling to floor, covered in books. Now, today I'd be like, that's so exciting. But back then I'm like, that's being like in a room full of snakes. I've never read a book, right? I'm not a good reader. And what makes it worse, he starts grabbing snakes off the shelves and handing them to me, right? And I started looking at these titles, and they're these very early personal growth books, and like Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, Thinking We're Rich, Napoleon Hill, all those, Dale Carnegie, and some very early biographies of some, historical individuals. And he's like, "Jim, I want you to read one book a week." And I'm like, "Are you kidding? Have you not listened to everything I just said? I can't, I have midterms, I have schoolwork." And he said, when I said schoolwork, he said, "Jim, don't let school get in the way of your education." And I didn't realize it was a Mark Twain quote, this was 30 years ago. And I was like, that's great insight. And I still can't commit. So if I'm going to commit, I'm going to do it, right? If I say I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it.
Right.
And he's like, very smart man. He takes out my bucket list and he starts reading, Jay, my dreams out loud, one by one. And I don't know, I get choked up thinking about it, because imagine I'm an 18-year-old kid, doesn't know anything for anything. And you start hearing your own dreams in someone else's voice, incanted out in like the universe, and it just messed with my mind and my spirit, something fierce. And honestly, a lot of things on that list were things I wanted to do for my family, things they could never afford, or even if they had the money, they would never do for themselves. So with that motivation, I agreed to read one book a week. To make a long story short, fast forward, I'm back at school. I'm at my desk. I have a pile of books I have to read for school and a pile of books I promised to read. And I already couldn't get through pile A. So where do I get the time? I don't eat, I don't sleep, I don't work out, I don't socialize, I don't do anything but just live in the library for weeks and weeks and weeks. And one night I pass out at 2:00 in the morning in the library, going down a flight of stairs. I fell, I hit my head again, and I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. And at this point, I was wasted away. Like, I thought I died. I was down to 117 pounds. I was just wasting away because I wasn't eating or taking care of myself. And the nurse came in with a mug of tea, and on it was a picture of Albert Einstein, and, genius, the opposite of me. But it had a quote on it that spoke to me. It said, his quote, and we've all heard this in some iteration, the same level of thinking that's created your problem won't solve your problem. The same level of thinking that's created your problem won't solve it. And it made me think, what's my problem? Well, I have a broken brain. I'm a very slow learner. How do I think differently about it? Well, maybe I could learn how to fix my brain. Maybe I could learn how to learn faster. So I was like, where do you do that? In school, right? So I look at course bulletin, look at all these classes, and they're all classes on what to learn, math, history, science, Spanish, whatever, but not how
to learn,
or how to use my brain. And I really make that my study, and I start studying everything I can get my hands on, ancient memory techniques and speed reading, neuroscience, multiple intelligence theory, adult learning theory. And about 60 days into it, a light switch flipped on, and all of a sudden I started to understand things for the very first time in my life. And, and I sort of retain it and understand. Did my grades improve, but with it, my life improved. But the bow on it, though, the reason I'm doing this 3 decades later is I couldn't help but help other people. Like shame on me if other people are suffering and struggling, and I know something that could help them and I don't help them. And I started tutoring, and one of my very first students, she's a freshman, she read 30 books in 30 days. Now that's just not scan, like really read it.
Well, so you were tutoring her, but you were teaching her what you learned how to speed read.
Exactly. So I taught her. I wanted to find out not how. I know exactly how because I taught her. I wanted to know why, because I think a lot of people know what to do, but they don't always do what they know. I think that common sense is definitely not common practice. Like we know we should do certain things, right? Prioritize sleep or eat a certain way or exercise or meditate, whatever it is, but we don't always do it. And I wanted to find out what motivated her. And I found out her mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer by doctors, given only a couple months to live, like 60 days to live. And the books she was reading were books to save her mom's life. And I wished her luck, prayers. 6 months goes by. I get a call from this young lady. It's the first time I heard from her since. And she's crying hysterically. And when she stopped, I found out they're tears of joy that her mother not only survived, but is really getting better. Doctors don't know how, they don't know why. The doctors were calling it a miracle. But her mother attributed the turnaround, not only bouncing back, but bouncing forward to the great advice she got from her daughter, who learned it from all these books. And in that moment, I realized that if knowledge is power, then learning is our superpower. And it's a superpower we all have. So I dedicated my life every single day for the past 31 years to showing people how to unlock that genius. And that's
incredible. But how did you go from thinking you couldn't learn? What got you to think you could learn to speed? To what unlocked you to be able to speed read when you weren't able to read?
To do all these things. I mean, when people see me on stage, and I'm in front of a good 250,000 people a year live. I could be on last month I was in 3 continents in 1 week. Speaking, and sometimes I'll do these demonstrations where I'll have like 100 people in an audience stand up and pass around a mic and introduce themselves, and I'll memorize all their names, or they give me 100 random words or 100 numbers, and I'll recall them forwards and backwards. But I always tell people I don't do this to impress you. I do this to express to you what's possible, because the truth is every single person listening right now, regardless of their age, their background, their career, their education level, their financial situation, their gender, their history, their IQ even, they can do that and a lot more. We just weren't taught. Going to your kid and saying, focus or study, that's like going to a child and say, play the ukulele, who's never taken a class or a seminar on how to play that instrument. Well, we've never taken a class called focus, just like we've never taken a class on mental health, right? Or financial literacy, or some of the things that I feel like would be, very useful for us, today in this age and stage that we live in. But my powers, if you will, came from just studying and discipline, just like anyone else, just like sports, right? It's
outworking the world.
Right. Exactly. And making it practical, so you learn, I believe, to earn, to be able to return, but it definitely took work, without a doubt. There was no magic memory pill, certainly, but there were processes, and I think one of the gifts I've developed over time is I believe genius leaves clues. That if someone is exceptional in some area, that they're doing certain things, and there's a method behind what looks like magic to everybody else, and my goal is to kind of show people a blueprint on how to do that, and